That couldn't be on there.
Absolutely could. So welcome everybody to the first installment of the Sullivan County Republican Committee Speakers Forums. Anybody hear about some controversy about this? Okay. Well, just for the record, okay, the Progressive Socialist Warriors are under the impression that tonight's event has been canceled. It is Friday, October 4th, and Robert Spencer is presenting in Sullivan County. We will not stand idly by and let our constitutional rights be trampled upon.
Amen.
And as I said to the Valley News today when they called me for a quote, people had better wake up and people had better stand up and defend liberty. Today, the Sullivan County Republican Committee's First Amendment rights were under attack. Tomorrow, it could be yours. And who's going to be left to fight for you? Who's going to be left to speak up for you? I, for one, am not about to yield, capitulate, fall down, bend over, or ask for forgiveness or permission from radical, progressive Democrat socialists in this state or anywhere else. I will fight them to the death. And we need solid Republicans who are willing to fight. This day of wishy-washy Republicans, listen, we've got a republic to save. They are in this to win this. And it is game on for them. If we roll over, if we acquiesce, if we only have speakers that the Democrat Party approves of, what's the point? I, for one, am proud that I'm bringing a speaker here who the Democrats don't approve of. Maybe there's a reason why they don't approve of him. It's also interesting that they won't debate him. Robert Spencer is the director of Jihad Watch and a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center, the author of 19 books, including the New York Times bestsellers The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades, and The Truth About Muhammad, along with the best-selling The History of Jihad, From Muhammad to ISIS. Forthcoming in 2019 is The Palestinian Delusion, The Catastrophic History of the Middle East Peace Process. Mr. Spencer has led seminars on Islam and Jihad for the FBI, the United States Central Command, the United States Army Command, and General Staff College, along with the U.S. Army's Asymmetric Warfare Group and the Joint Terrorism Task Force. As well, the Justice Department's Anti-Terrorism Advisory Council and the U.S. intelligence community. He's discussed jihad, Islam, and terrorism at a workshop sponsored by the U.S. State Department and the German Foreign Ministry. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Robert Spencer.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for having the courage to come. I hope nobody finds out. No, seriously, I hope you'll pardon me. I'm going to talk a little bit about what just happened because it is emblematic of the crisis that the United States in general is in today. And so I'm going to be, of necessity, a little bit self-referential. But please do bear in mind, this is not really about me. As Keith said, what has happened to us in this incident is something that's going to happen to other people. You know, we learned this in 5th grade, and everybody's forgotten. You don't give in to a bully, because then the bully will demand more of you. And that's exactly what many people in this area have done. Not you. You're here, that shows that you're not willing to give in to the bully. But to give in to the bully will only embolden him and make him more demanding. Standing up to the bully and saying you're not going to give in to what he wants is the only way to restore some semblance of order. And so, in the first place, I commend you for having the courage to be here, and I wanted to point out that we live in an age of pandemic cowardice, in which everybody has somehow decided that the best thing to do for a bully is give him everything he wants.
Stick your head in the sand.
Yes. And so I'm going to go through a few things from this incident to explain some general principles that I think it's very important for all of us to bear in mind as we go forward. And to do that, I printed out a few of the statements that were made during the past week. In the first place, I'm sure she's a friend of some of you, New Hampshire State Senator Martha S. Hennessy. Wrote very happily this morning, "It is clear that Robert Spencer does not embody the welcoming, inclusive values of Claremont or New Hampshire." So, okay, I'm a terrible guy. I do not embody the values, apparently, of this area. I don't know this area very well, and I guess that may be true, but I think to explore a little bit about what she means by that, we need to look at what I have been doing all these years. And that is, I have been trying to call attention to and raise awareness about the reality of Islamic jihad terrorism and Sharia oppression. Sharia is Islamic law, and Islamic law is a recognized body of laws that cover every aspect of life, without any exception. There is nothing you can even think of doing as a human being that there are not Sharia laws for. And Sharia mandates the oppression of women and other people, and it has various other aspects that are at variance with the principles that we take for granted and cherish in this republic. And so I've been trying to call attention to that by raising awareness about Sharia and trying to catalog in my day-to-day website, Jihad Watch, the jihad activity, terrorist activity that is taking place on an ongoing basis in the United States and around the world. Now, does Martha Hennessy think that tracking jihad terror activity and opposing it and opposing Sharia oppression is not a value that people in New Hampshire have or should have? Actually, the answer to that is yes. That's what she thinks. She thinks that to do these things is to be racist and bigoted and Islamophobic, and is thus to be rejected as not being as inclusive as she wants to be. Now, what do the people that she is very concerned not be attacked have in mind for her? Let's look at the Quran, the holy book of Islam. This is, as many of you know, I'm sure, somewhat akin to the Bible in Christianity, although the Quran actually has a greater status in Islam than the Bible does in Christianity. Because people understand that the Bible is the words of human beings, but inspired by God. And then you have some Bibles, you know, where the words of Christ are printed in red, and people say this is the direct word of God. That's great. But the Quran is something different altogether. In Islamic belief, the Quran was dictated by Allah in every word of it. And he spoke every word of it. Now, if you compare that to the New Testament, where it says the gospel according to Matthew, according to Mark, according to Luke and John, there is some recognition. And then the letters of Paul, the letters of Peter, and so on. There's a recognition that there is a human involvement in this, that it is these human beings who are giving us the Word of God. In Islam, there is no according to. It's all the words of Allah. And so, let's see. In the first place, let me say that I got this Quran over in London in 2009. I was there to film parts of a documentary, spent about a week there. It was a very interesting place. And what I did while I was in London was pretty much what every American tourist will do when they go to Britain, and that is I toured the local mosques. So in one of them, I went to the Finsbury Park Mosque. I was given this Quran. The Finsbury Park Mosque is very notorious. A few years back, there was an imam, which is a Muslim clergyman, a religious leader, and he was the imam at the Finsbury Park Mosque. A mosque, of course, what's her name? Martha Hennessy would tell you, well, that's just like a Muslim church. You know, it's where Muslims go to worship. This man had 2 hooks for hands because his hands had been blown off in a bomb-making accident. You know how that can happen. I'm sure your parish priest has had his hands blown off making bombs. But these kinds of things are common, right? In any case, his name was Abu Hamza al-Masri. And he was the imam of the Finsbury Park Mosque. He was plotting jihad terror activities. As a matter of fact, he was involved in setting up an Al-Qaeda terrorist group training camp in Oregon, the United States state of Oregon out west. And he was caught. He was removed from his position as the imam in this mosque, and he is now in prison in the United States. But the thing about Abu Hamza is that, of course, for years he was preaching. And he was preaching at the Finsbury Park Mosque, and he was preaching hatred of non-Muslims, terrorism, the need to fight against unbelievers, and so on. Now, a lot of those people are still around. But the Finsbury Park Mosque, which still exists, assures us that everything is okay. When I went in there, I actually said, I hear you had some trouble here a few years back. And the very nice young man who had met me there, he said, yes, we did, but it's all gone now. We're all moderates here now. And so they gave me this moderate Quran. Now, this moderate Quran, it's the same text, of course, it's an English translation, but it's the same text as any other Quran. But the notes, the footnotes, the explanatory material comes from Syed Abu Ala Maududi, who was a Pakistani Muslim leader. He died in 1979, so that's not all that long ago. Some of us remember 1979. And he was the founder of Jamaat Islami, which is still the largest Muslim political party, Islamic political party that wants to impose Islamic law in Pakistan. And he wrote also a lengthy commentary on the Quran. It's a multi-volume set, but this is a 1-volume digest of it. Now, he is very influential. If you go into your local Islamic bookstore and ask for the writings of Maududi, I guarantee you they will have them. He is not, in other words, some extremist fringe character that nobody pays any attention to. And what he says, well, first let me give you the verse. And I don't think Martha Hennessy, that's her name, right? Martha Hennessy, I don't think she's read this. She's not here tonight, right? I invited her to come. I told her I'd buy her ticket, but I don't think she took me up on it. Fight against those who do not believe in Allah or in the last day, even though they are the people of the book. The people of the book is the Quran's term primarily for Jews and Christians. And do not hold forbidden what Allah and his messenger, that's Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, have forbidden. And do not follow the religion of truth, guess which one that is. Fight against them until they pay the jizya, which is a tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Now, that was the Quran, chapter 9, verse 29. But let's see what Maududi says that means. Because above all, I want you to come away from here not thinking, well, Spencer, you know, he's a hate-mongering, bigoted, racist, Islamophobe, enemy of everything that is good. And he told us that the wonderful book of peace, the Quran, actually said to fight against unbelievers. And no doubt he was cherry-picking and taking passages out of context in ways that completely are against everything that Muslims actually believe. And so we'll deal with that. Instead of believing me, listen to Maududi. I didn't write this book. I didn't write the commentary. I am not a Pakistani Muslim leader. And none of this originated with me. And this is his explanation of that passage. The purpose for which the Muslims are required to fight. First, let's stop there. Did you get that? Required to fight. Not just you may fight, or if you are attacked, you should fight, but you are required to fight. And the purpose is this. It's not, as one might think, to compel the unbelievers into embracing Islam. So isn't that nice? They're not fighting. They're required to fight, but they're not fighting to force non-Muslims to become Muslims. Great. Okay, but let's go on. Rather, its purpose is to put an end to the suzerainty, that is the rule, the suzerainty, the hegemony, the political power of the unbelievers, so that the latter, the unbelievers, are unable to rule over people. Did you catch that? The purpose is to put an end to the suzerainty of the unbelievers, so that the latter are unable to rule over people. The purpose, you see, is to fight against unbelievers so that they can have no political power. They are unable to rule over people, not unable to rule over the Muslim people, not unable to rule over the Palestinians or the Iraqis or some subgroup of the Muslim people, but unable to rule over people, Muslim, non-Muslim, in America, in Australia, in France, wherever, in New Hampshire. The authority to rule should only be vested in those who follow the true faith. Unbelievers who do not follow this true faith should live in a state of subordination. The Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All men are created equal. Those who do not follow this true faith should live in a state of subordination, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Anybody who becomes convinced of the truth of Islam may accept the faith of his or her own volition. The unbelievers are required to pay jizya, that's that tax, in return for the security provided to them as the dhimmis of an Islamic state. Jizya symbolizes the submission of the unbelievers to the suzerainty of Islam. Now, I don't want this to get too complicated. I want to be very clear. I used another word there. I was quoting Maududi, and he said that the unbelievers have to live as dhimmis. What does that mean? The protected people. It sounds nice, doesn't it? To be protected. Like, here we are, maybe in an Islamic state, the Muslims would be outside guarding in case anybody wanted to attack, in case Martha Hennessy came by with an AK, you know? So, the protection, however, that is envisioned is not exactly like that. This is another Islamic book. This is Reliance of the Traveler, which is a manual of Islamic law. You want to know what Islamic law is? It's in here. Don't believe me? Let's go to the Al-Azhar Islamic Research Academy. Al-Azhar is actually the foremost Islamic institution among Sunni Muslims, and that's 85% of Muslims worldwide, the Sunnis. Barack Obama, when he was giving his outreach speech to the Islamic world in June 2009, he chose Al-Azhar to speak because it is such a prestigious and ancient and venerable and respected institution. And Al-Azhar has a little note at the beginning of this book, and it says that this book conforms to the practice and faith of the Orthodox Sunni community. It conforms to the practice and faith of the Orthodox Sunni community. So if you want to know what Sunni Islam is all about, this is it. It's certified by one of their foremost authorities. And it says that Muslims must make war upon Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians until they become Muslim, or else pay the non-Muslim poll tax. You just heard me quote that from the Quran and say the same thing from Maududi. And if they are conquered and they're living as protected people, the dhimmis, in the Islamic State, this is what that means. That you've got to pay this tax. That tax, the jizya, that's what the word means, tax. The Muslims don't have to pay it. The non-Muslims actually are responsible for the upkeep of the Muslims. The Caliph Umar, the second successor of Muhammad as the leader of the Muslims, and a revered figure in Sunni Islam, he said, be sure to always collect the jizya because it is the source of your livelihood. In other words, the non-Muslims are going to pay for you to live. You don't have to become a farmer or shopkeeper or a merchant or whatever. Because what you need to do is conquer the unbelievers, make them submit as the dhimmis, and then they will pay you. Also, the non-Muslim subjects are obliged, it says rather, to comply with Islamic rules. And the Islamic rules that they have to comply with are, they are distinguished from Muslims in dress, wearing a wide cloth belt, or zunnar. Now, that might seem irrelevant. They are distinguished from Muslims in dress. But what that is it's so that you always know, if you're a Muslim, that a non-Muslim is coming. Because the next rule is, non-Muslims are not greeted with Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum is a universal Islamic greeting. It means peace be upon you. When a Muslim meets another Muslim, if they are devout and observant, then... Are we having trouble with the video?
No, it's all good.
All right. I would hate for that to happen, that's why. Because you see, you strike me down, and I will become 10,000 times more powerful than before. And so they think they closed down this event. Wait till I put up this video. And thousands of people will see it. And I wasn't even going to ask that it be videoed before all this happened. So anyway, the thing is, Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. A Muslim, I see you, you're a Muslim, I'm a Muslim. Assalamu alaikum, habibi. And exactly, peace be upon you. But if you see a non-Muslim coming, then you do not say peace be upon you. You say peace be upon those who are rightly guided. That is, peace be upon us, not you. Because the non-Muslims are not rightly guided. There's more to it than that also. The non-Muslims must keep to the side of the street. Now I just found out, you're from Alabama, I overheard. Before your time, before any of our times, there were the Jim Crow laws in Alabama, and there were Jim Crow laws all over the South, and the black people, one of the things they would have to do was step off the sidewalk if a white person was coming. It was a sign of superiority and inferiority. It was a sign of deference, of a submission, a certain kind of submission.
I experienced that.
Well, there you go. And this was a terrible, this is a blot in the history of the United States, and it's a great thing that the United States is the only country, really, where there was an ingrained racism that has been overcome. Although now the left is doing their best to bring it back. But the Jim Crow laws, actually, they got nothing on this. Just like it wasn't Hitler who invented the badge, the distinguishing dress for the Jews, it was the Muslims who stipulated, these laws have not changed over 1,400 years, stipulated that the non-Muslims had to wear a separate kind of clothing. They are not to be greeted with the peace. They have to step off the street if a Muslim is coming and defer. And I've known many people from Lebanon, Syria, which are supposedly moderate places, where they say that still happens. Because the Muslims demand it, and you could get beat up or worse if you just walk along the street like anybody else. They may not build higher than or as high as the Muslims' buildings. That is, you're always in a state of submission. And they are forbidden to openly display wine or pork, to ring church bells or display crosses. You have to do it all furtively and privately. Eastern churches in the Islamic world, even to this day, they don't have bells because of these rules. They have to be very quiet and furtive about their worship. In Egypt, the Coptic churches, many times nowadays, Muslims build big mosques right next to the churches and then broadcast the Islamic call to prayer over loudspeakers into the church while the church is having the services. They are forbidden to build new churches or to repair old ones, so that the communities are always in decline and the Muslim communities are always growing. And in Egypt also, this is playing out today. Even though these laws are not fully in force in Egypt today, they were abolished there in the 1850s. But because these are Islamic laws, because these are parts of Sharia, which is considered to be given by God, as much as Christians believe the Ten Commandments come from God, there are many Muslims in Egypt and all over the Islamic world who think, we've got to reapply these laws. And that means that the Christians are not allowed to build new churches. Egypt has a lot of Christians. The official number is about 6%, but some people estimate it's as many as 20%. And they don't have enough churches. But if they try to repair one of their old churches or to build a new one, the government says you can't have a permit for that. If you come in and say, I want a permit to build a mosque, you'll get the permit right away. But a church can't get a permit. A lot of times, they get the permit, and then they start building, and then a mob forms and knocks down what they built, because it's against Islamic law. So this is just the opposite of being endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. This is just the opposite of all men are created equal. Islam actually institutionalizes discrimination and contempt for the non-Muslim. So what exactly are the welcoming, inclusive values of Claremont or New Hampshire that Martha Hennessy wants to reinforce? She's been told, I'm sure she doesn't know me from Adam, but she's been told that I am indeed an enemy of all that is good and stand against all her values. The problem is with that she is naively and ignorantly. And it was shut down a few years back because it was discovered to have been funneling its charitable contributions to the terror group Hamas. And Hamas was obviously using it for malevolent purposes. When the Holy Land Foundation went on trial, when it first happened, it was raided, its offices were raided by the FBI. Now the FBI is a whole other story, but back then it was a fairly worthwhile organization, and the FBI went into their offices and carted out all these documents. One of the documents they found in the Holy Land Foundation offices was a program for North America from a group called the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is one of the largest Islamic organizations in the world. Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the terror groups, come from it. And the Muslim Brotherhood took power in Egypt a few years back, but they so misruled the country that they were kicked out after a year. But there's still very much a presence in Egypt, and they have a presence all over the world. Without exception, every major Muslim organization in the United States is connected to the Muslim Brotherhood. And we know that in large part because they were listed in this document. Also listed in this document was the objective of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States, which it said was, and I quote, eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers so that it falls and Allah's religion is victorious over other religions. Now, let me say that again. Eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house by their hands and the hands of the believers so that it falls and Allah's religion is victorious over other religions. There's one part of that I want to emphasize. By their hands and the hands of the believers. Who's that their hands? That's us. We in Western civilization, they're going to make us destroy ourselves. How have they done that? One of the primary ways that Islamic organizations and their allies on the left have done that in the United States is to make people think that it's racist and bigoted and hateful to oppose a radically violent and expansionist ideology that would subjugate large portions of the population and deny them basic rights. Sorry, that's me. I have to take a couple of pills now, but I don't have them with me. So we're just going to skip over that portion of the evening. Now think about that. They're going to make us eliminate and destroy Western civilization by our own hand. What better way but to stigmatize any resistance to their program? And look how well it's worked. Martha Hennessy not only got this thing canceled from the second one, the Elks, but she thinks she's righteous in doing so. Now, you could say, or if Martha were here, she would probably say, well, I'm against terrorism, of course, and I'm going to fight terrorism, but you're just a bigot who goes too far. Well, let me tell you something else. The Muslim Brotherhood organizations in the United States, the Council on American Islamic Relations, the Muslim Public Affairs Council, the Muslim American Society, the Islamic Society of North America, every other one that I could name, everybody, without exception, every last person who calls attention to this threat gets the same treatment I got this week. It ain't just me. Not only that, but there is not a single person that those groups, the Council on American Islamic Relations is the foremost, and others, there is not a single one that says, these guys over here, they're counter-terrorist analysts who are okay. There aren't any. It's all a scam, you see. They portray anybody who sticks his neck out about this as a racist, bigoted, hateful person. Now, why do they do that? Because, you see, look what I just did tonight. I read their books. And that's the worst thing I could possibly do, because what on earth can they say? That ain't in our books? It is. It's obvious. You can look in the books and see if I made it up. It's all in here. And you can go get these books on Amazon or anywhere else, and you'll see that it's all in there and worse. And what else can they say? Well, we don't really pay attention to those things. You're reading from fringe guys. Maududi, as I explained before, is not fringe. And if I actually doubt you have an Islamic bookstore around here, but if you do, you will soon. And when you do, go in and ask for Maududi, and they will give you 10 books of his they carry or more. And this is not fringe, it's Al-Azhar. Where did Barack Obama speak? Al-Azhar. Al-Azhar says you got to make war against the Jews and Christians and subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law and deny them all those rights. It's right in here where I read. So did Obama go to speak before a fringe extremist organization? Or maybe these things are a little more mainstream than Martha Hennessy wants to acknowledge. Now there's more. Kevin Landrigan, are you here? Kevin Landrigan of the Union Leader? No? Oddly enough, yeah. Oddly enough, you know, I've got to say, I'm sorry. I have to apologize because I thought these people were journalists. But journalists actually check their sources and get both sides of the story. And last week, Kevin Landrigan of the New Hampshire Union Leader wrote an article about my coming here, and that was the first I had heard that he knew anything about it. He never contacted me. He never asked me for comment, not before or after. I wrote him tonight and invited him to be here. I'm surprised he didn't make it. And I would have sprung for his ticket too, Martha's and Kevin's, on the house, but they didn't come. Now, in this article in the New Hampshire Union Leader, it says that it quotes actually the Southern Poverty Law Center. And it says, I am one of the most prolific, thank you, one of the most prolific anti-Muslim figures in the United States. Now, in the first place, the Southern Poverty Law Center. There is a paper in Washington, the Washington Post, and it has been widely criticized by President Trump and many other people for being not really a newspaper, but a propaganda organ for the left. And the Washington Post ran a big story last year saying the Southern Poverty Law Center is labeling people as hate groups unfairly. I'm about 5 hate groups for the Southern Poverty Law Center. Me individually, my website, Jihad Watch, the David Horowitz Freedom Center that I'm affiliated with, the American Freedom Defense Initiative that I'm vice president of. What else? I'm a couple other hate groups too in there, but I mean, I'm a really bad guy. But the thing is that what even the Washington Post admitted that the Southern Poverty Law Center does this. What they're trying to do is discredit people like me, and by no means only me, by saying that we are like the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan. We are like David Duke. We are like the neo-Nazis. And so nobody who's decent should have anything to do with us. Now, in all of that, do they say Spencer says this and it's false? No, they don't say that. Do they say Spencer says that all Muslims do this or that? Well, they do say that I'm an anti-Muslim figure. But I've never actually said anything about all Muslims. You can't generalize about people that way. And though I'm constantly accused of doing so, I challenge any of these people to find in 19 books and thousands of articles any place where I've actually done that. There's a spectrum among Muslims of belief, knowledge, and fervor, just as there is among Christians. Some of you may be very serious Christians, and some of you may not be. And all of you probably know some people who are very serious Christians, and also some people who say they're Christians but are not very serious Christians. And it's the same thing in Islam. So what I deal with is Islamic teaching. Some Muslims take it very seriously. Some don't. Some know all about it. Some don't. It's just like anything else. But anyway, in dealing with this Islamic teaching, Kevin Landrigan quotes the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, saying that I'm anti-Muslim. So let me ask you this. In World War II, we fought the Nazis. The Nazis, you see those films, they have this huge crowd, and Hitler's going through, and they are cheering wildly. They love him. Right? And yet, when we fought the Nazis, did people say we were anti-German bigots who just hate Germans? Now, there were some Germans, a small group that didn't like Hitler and didn't like the Nazis. After World War II, of course, every German became a part of that group. And they all said, oh, yes, yes, we hated him. We had nothing to do with him. We only went along because he would kill us. But the fact is that if I am anti-Muslim, then to fight against the Nazis was anti-German. And we shouldn't have done it because that would be bigotry. Raymond Buckley. Is Raymond here?
He said his regrets.
Little Ray.
The Democratic Party chairman. Is he the Democratic Party chairman of the whole state or the area? This area? Okay, Democratic Party chairman of New Hampshire. Okay. And he said the New Hampshire Republican Party is bringing in anti-Muslim white supremacist Robert Spencer. Well, I thought, when I saw this, Keith actually showed this part to me, and I couldn't believe it. I thought, what a dope. Because, see, there's this guy, Richard Spencer, and he is really more of a media creation than anything else. But he's a real Nazi. I've had a little bit of interaction with him on Twitter, and he said, I know you are a Jew. You have changed your name. Well, your name is not really Spencer. What is your real name, Jew? And I mean, this guy's really seriously anti-Semitic and a Nazi. But his name is Richard B. Spencer. And my name is Robert B. Spencer. And somehow, there's a large number of people, when they see these two names, they can't tell them apart. Ask Raymond Buckley about former President Robert Nixon and the atheist philosopher Robert Dawkins. Because Raymond Buckley called me a white supremacist. I challenged Raymond. I couldn't find an email address, but I found him on Twitter, and I wrote to him. Oddly enough, he didn't answer. And I asked him, find something in everything that I've written. I've written so much stuff. Find something that's racist. Find something that's white supremacist. You won't be able to because there ain't anything in there like that. This is not a racial issue. There are Muslims of all races. There are Islamic jihadis of all races. To say that to oppose jihad terror is racist is just, it's ridiculous and incoherent. It would be like saying that opposing Hitler was racist or anti-German. It had nothing to do with it. I mean, Hitler was the racist, not the people that were fighting against him. And the people who I am trying to raise awareness about are the ones who are the real bigots and the really intolerant people and the people who will really carry out oppression if they come into power. Me, I like the US Constitution. I want to see the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, all these things. But I don't want to see one group gaining hegemony over the others and subjugating the others as inferiors under their law. So, I'm a terrible guy. John P. Gregg of the illustrious Valley News. Is John, you here? I invited him. I don't understand it. They could have come and seen for themselves. I thought they were journalists. You see what I mean? They said, this guy's a terrible guy, and he's going to do terrible things. And they could have come and had a story, you know? The gargoyle spoke. And he said, let us hate everyone and be evil. And here we have the story, and the Democrats were right, and Raymond Buckley was right, and Martha Hennessy was right. They're not here. They don't care. Maybe they know that I'm not anything like that in real life. But John P. Gregg, I can think of a few things that stands for, but I won't say, has the goal of vilifying and maligning Muslims and the Islamic faith. That's actually another quote from the Southern Poverty Law Center. But you notice, he doesn't quote me. He didn't reach out to me when he wrote his first story. I wrote to him after that, and then he asked me for comment on his second story. That's another thing. He never bothered to try to contact me for his first story. And don't think I was thinking anything obscene about his middle name. Just something like Pumpkinhead, you know. But anyway, the thing is that the goal of vilifying and maligning Muslims. What did I do tonight? I read from the Quran. I read from a respected commentary on the Quran. I read from a manual of Islamic law that is certified by one of the foremost authorities in Sunni Islam as reflecting the practice and faith of the Orthodox Sunni community. How is that vilifying? If I came in here and I said, hello, I am Robert Spencer, not Richard, and he said, hello, I am Robert Spencer, not Richard, would I say, you're vilifying me? All I did was quote you, right? I just quoted their stuff. But it seems like maybe there's some people who don't want these things to be known, and that's the real problem. So, notice also that the Sullivan County Republican Committee, now I know some of you are part of that. Aren't you the head of that?
Indeed.
So, I know this isn't you, but the Sullivan County Republican Committee moved a fundraiser featuring a speaker with controversial views on Islam. That is, I quote them. And the owners of the initial venue, the Eastman Community Association, were worried about possible protests. In the interest of public safety, we have no choice but to cancel Friday's event. They didn't have a choice. They had to. In the interest of public safety. Now, what did I say at the beginning? You give in to a bully, you're going to get more bullying. So if the Sullivan County Republican Committee or if Eastman Community Association thinks, well, they'll cancel Spencer and this problem will go away, who was going to put on the possible protests? Was I going to come out and incite you all and say, let's go and protest at the mosque? Of course not. Yes, sir.
I would just ask everybody in the room, does anybody remember all the rioting and the flipping over cars and setting trash cans on fire when the Eastman Community Association actually hosted a transgendered speaker talking about transgenderism?
I'll bet nothing happened, right?
I don't remember that. No.
There you go.
Do you remember the riot police that were out with the shields and the tear gas and the batons when they had the guy spouting carbon dioxide, bloviating about man-made climate change? No, me neither, because you know what? It didn't happen.
So obviously it was the left that was going to be protesting, and the Eastman Community Association said they had no choice but to submit and kowtow. So you know what the left is going to do? They're going to say if the Eastman Community Association ever does anything else we don't like, we'll just do that again, because we already know they'll fold. Now, John Gregg wrote a follow-up article this morning because he's such an intrepid journalist. And he said, Asma El-Huni, the lead organizer of the United Valley Interfaith Project, pointed out that the right-wing Norwegian extremist Anders Behring Breivik, who killed 77 people in a 2011 bomb attack and shooting spree, appeared to be influenced by Spencer. Breivik quoted Spencer 64 times in his manifesto. Yes, he did quote me. You know who else he quoted? Barack Obama, John F. Kennedy, Charles Darwin. We better lock these guys up. This is terrible. Or ban their books. The fact is, Anders Behring Breivik had this 1,000-page manifesto. It was just a lot of crazy, nutty stuff. And one of the things that he did was he took the script. Now, this is also an interesting little tidbit. I was in a documentary in like 2002. Islam, What the West Needs to Know. I think it's on YouTube, but they might have taken it off by now. But Islam, What the West Needs to Know was a documentary, as I said, featuring many people speaking, including me, about various aspects of Islamic teaching. And once again, we quoted the Quran, we quoted Islamic authorities. There was nothing insightful, I-N-C-I-T-E, inciting about it. It was very insightful, S-I-G-H-T, that's another thing. And there was nothing calling for violence or justifying violence or anything of the kind. It was just a documentary about Islamic teaching, trying to explicate what had happened. Oh, you got it. Yeah, there it is, still there. Explicate what had happened on 9/11. Breivik, now there was a transcript of this documentary in Breivik's manifesto. And if you've ever seen a movie script or a play script, you know how it is. Whoever speaks, they name who speaks, and then there's what he's supposed to say. Hamlet, to be or not to be, that is the question. And every time Hamlet speaks, it says again, Hamlet, right? So every time I spoke in that thing, it said Robert Spencer. And it's 100 pages long or whatever, the transcript. Now the interesting tidbit is the transcript was never published anywhere. How did Breivik get it? Still don't know. But I don't have the answer to that. I just offer that to you for cogitation. But he had it anyway. And it was flawless, even though he was not a native English speaker. And it names me. Yes, I get quoted every time I speak. And that's the majority of the quotes there in there. But there's another even more important thing. Breivik says in his manifesto that he was influenced not by me, but by Al-Qaeda, the Jihad terrorist group. And he said he saw in the 90s, before 9/11, and also incidentally, before I had published anything about Islam. I was doing consulting about Islam in the 90s, but I had not published any books. And I did not have the website. He says that he was influenced by Al-Qaeda to become violent. Not only that, but he names me and several other people, and he says, what's wrong with these people is they don't call for violence. So he's saying I did not influence him. And they say, oh yes, but see, he's against Islamization and you're against Islamization. Okay, if every idea is discredited by somebody being violent, then the Democrats should not be socialists. And yet they are, even though millions of people have been killed in the name of socialism. So that can't be it. The whole thing is a wash. I did not influence Breivik. It's just used as a part of my rap sheet to turn people away from what I might say. He paints Muslims with one brush, says Asma El-Huni of United Valley Interfaith Project. Did I paint Muslims with one brush? Let me ask you. Did I say all Muslims believe this?
No.
Did I not say exactly the opposite?
Yes.
If you go to 20 of my talks on YouTube and watch every last one of them, I will say that in every one of them, or most of them. And I will never say that all Muslims believe this. But the idea that I paint Muslims with one brush, this here again, this is just a false statement designed to make people think there's something wrong with this, we shouldn't have it. And then she goes on to say there's no one Sharia for the Islamic world. My Sharia teaches me that I should make sure my neighbors don't go hungry. My Sharia teaches me to take care of the poor and orphaned. Aww. Okay, well, I'm glad she has such a lovely Sharia, but let's think about this carefully. Sharia, Islamic law, is the law of the land in several countries in the world. The governments of several countries in the world are dedicated to applying Sharia in every sphere of life that they can. And these countries are the Islamic Republic of Iran, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, for the most part, Northern Sudan, parts of Somalia. Do you start to see a pattern? Every last one of those countries, every place where Sharia is applied, it denies basic rights to women, denies basic rights to non-Muslims, denies the freedom of speech. Everywhere Sharia is applied, in the Aceh province, in Indonesia as well, way away from the Middle East. Everywhere it's applied, it looks the same. So yeah, I know there's not one Sharia. I've never said there was one Sharia. There are several schools of Islamic jurisprudence. Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali, and Hanafi for the Sunnis. And they're the Jafari school for the Shiites. These are schools of thought that apply, that have different understandings of Sharia. But I'll tell you, they agree on 75% of everything. And Asma El-Huni, if she has studied this, she knows this to be true, but was intentionally saying the opposite. Now, I'm not saying, maybe she doesn't, but you can look out at the Sharia states in the world and see what Sharia is. It ain't hard. You can also look at Islamic history. This is a book I wrote last year, The History of Jihad, from Muhammad to ISIS. 1,400 years of jihad activity. And I wrote it, I did not write in it what I thought. What I did was, I went and read the Islamic historians. A lot of the great Islamic rulers of the past, just like non-Muslim rulers, they had what are known as court historians. A court historian is the guy who writes down what happens. And so he's right there when it happens, and then he goes to his office and writes it down. And then as he does this every day, you have a history of the reign of so-and-so. And a lot of these court historians, their writings are readily available, and I read them. And I read wherever I could, primary sources about the Islamic conquests. And for 1,400 years, everywhere Muslims went, they created conflict with the non-Muslims and attempted to subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law. And nary a one of them said, no, wait, my Sharia is caring for the poor and hungry. My Sharia is blowing milk bubbles through a straw. Nobody did this. No, there was never any large-scale resistance to the violent jihadis among peaceful Muslims. And there was never any time when the non-Muslims and the Muslims lived in peace, except when the Muslims had the hegemony and the non-Muslims were paying the tax. So, all this is terrible, what is it now? It's not welcoming or inclusive. Well, I would submit to you that what is not welcoming or inclusive are the Islamic jihadis who believe this. And there are some in the United States, there are some in other countries. They do have a program to bring their rule to America, and we need to be aware of it. That's all. That's all I've been doing. And so if that is so terrible, and I am completely silenced, and other people like me are completely silenced, what will be the result? The result will be that they will be able to do whatever they want, and everybody will be afraid to speak out against them because they'll be afraid of being called a racist and a bigot and an Islamophobe and not being welcoming or inclusive, and clubs will close down their events and say that they are beyond the pale of acceptable discourse and no decent people should be seen in their company. And then what will happen? The jihad will advance unimpeded, unopposed, and eventually win. And so what we have to do, my friends, and I know I'm preaching to the choir for this part, but the video is going, I hope. We have to stand up to them and say we're not going to be intimidated and we're not going to be bullied. And refuse to allow them to manipulate us. And so what I think is probably one of the most distasteful elements of this whole episode is the fact that there are people in the Sullivan County Republican Party who say, well, really, can't we just get another speaker? It's not about me. You give in to them on this, they're just going to make you give in to them on everything else. And so what's the point of having an opposition? You're not in opposition anymore. You're just more of the same. Just like Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan and all those guys are not really an opposition party to the Democrats. They're just more of the same. And the only real opposition is that represented by the president. So, that is where I will end up. These are difficult times, and they call for courage. And they're going to probably get worse before they get better. But we do have one tremendous weapon on our side, and that is the truth. Asma El-Huni said something else I forgot to mention. She said, I don't know any Muslim who doesn't know Robert Spencer. Isn't she painting Muslims with a broad brush? We'll leave that aside. I don't know any Muslim who doesn't know Robert Spencer. Thanks, Asma. Thanks, Asma. This man is extremely dangerous. This man is extremely dangerous. I had to laugh. But what she fears is not me. What she fears is the truth. What she fears is Americans knowing what's in the Quran, and Americans knowing what's in Islamic law, and Americans knowing what's in Islamic history. That's what she's afraid of. Because the more Americans who know, the less likely they are to be able to make us eliminate and destroy Western civilization by our own hands. And I know none of you, my friends here tonight, are going to allow that to happen. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, we can go as long as you want to go with questions. Yes, sir.
Okay, I just wanted to ask in front of the question I asked you. If you really believe that these people are basically, you can't compromise, you can't change them, what the hell do you do?
Well, you're right. If you really believe that you cannot compromise or change these people, then what do you do, yes?
Do you want that on for the questions and
Yeah, sure, no problem. I have no secrets. I want people to know what I say, because if they really saw what I say, then they would say, wait a minute, this guy isn't really all that dangerous, or evil. Now, I forgot what I was saying, being so evil. We know that we're not going to change them. Yeah, because it's a religion. Religions tend to be resistant to change. You can't just say, hey, would you knock that stuff about fighting the unbelievers out of the Quran, please? Just redline that. They're not going to do that, you know? And the Quran says, I quoted you this before in chapter 5, verse 3, this day I have perfected your religion for you. Allah is speaking, of course. If your religion is perfect, then it admits of no reform. You're not going to change it. And anybody who tries to change it is going to be vilified. Innovation, bid'ah, is a grave sin in Islam. Because you don't innovate when the religion is already perfect. So what do? What we need to do is enforce our own laws. And then these things will fall into place. The solution is actually quite simple. That we say, we believe in the freedom of speech here. And so we do not take kindly to bringing in a system of laws that denies the freedom of speech. And we believe in the equality of rights of all people before the law. And so you will be prosecuted if you try to spread this ideology that denies the equality of rights of all people before the law. And on and on and on. For example, very, very easy example, polygamy. Polygamy, having more than one wife. And in the Quran, chapter 4, verse 3, a man is allowed to have 4 wives, up to 4 wives, as well as the captives of the right hand, which are slave girls. There's no limit on those. So, as many as you can capture. 4 wives. Now, in America, polygamy is illegal because it is considered to be a denial of the human dignity of women, because they're reduced to, you don't have marriage as a union of 2 people, but you have they're commodities who they don't have the same rights and the same dignity as the males do. All right? So it's illegal. It's illegal in the United States. A few years back, there was a fire in an apartment building in the Bronx, in New York City. And the fire killed several people. It was a terrible tragedy. And I was reading the story about the fire the next day in the New York Times. And it said that the man who lived there was killed along with at least 2 of his wives. And that he was living in a polygamous arrangement. He was a Muslim migrant from, I believe, North Africa. And there are many other stories. As a matter of fact, Ibrahim Hooper of the Council on American Islamic Relations has admitted, says there are actually thousands of polygamous families in the United States. One of them was a guy named Siraj ibn Wahhaj, who last year went out to New Mexico. He was living in Florida, I believe. And in New Mexico, he left one of his wives in Florida, went out to New Mexico with another one of his wives, and started a terror training camp where they were actually training children to be school shooters, you know, go into the schools with guns. One of the little kids, one of the students. But they were caught, they were stopped, for which we can all be grateful. But Siraj ibn Wahhaj was in a polygamous arrangement. He had more than one wife. Now, the United States is obviously not enforcing the laws against polygamy against Muslims today, because it would be Islamophobic, it would be racist, and there would be a big snafu. And so it's not being enforced. But I suggest to you that if they had been enforced, then this terrorist, Siraj ibn Wahhaj, would have been stopped before he started his terror training camp in New Mexico. He never would have gotten the opportunity to do that. Another thing is female genital mutilation, which is done to control women. And Muhammad said to do it. People constantly, every last story on this in the media says this has nothing to do with Islam, it's a cultural practice. But I can show you in here where Muhammad says it's an honor for men and for women. And most of the some of the schools of Islamic law require it. Some of them say it's a very good thing to do, even if it's not required. And so that's the kind of thing they differ on. There were a couple of doctors last year who were arrested in Detroit for doing it, and they were put on trial. First ever trial of FGM in the United States. And then a judge dropped the charges and said, you can't have a law against FGM in the United States. It's their freedom of religion. Well, we're going to have to decide. The LDS Church, the Latter-day Saints Church, had polygamy. And the United States government said in 1890 that the state of Utah, the territory of Utah, could not be admitted to the United States as a state until the LDS Church outlawed polygamy. Now, nobody cried about religious freedom. We understood then that there was a limit. Religious freedom obviously is not something that means we have to sit idly by and allow ourselves to be conquered and subjugated because it's their religion. It was never understood to be a suicide pill for the entire republic. And the polygamy was outlawed for the LDS Church because it was considered to be against the national interest and against existing American laws. And it's the same thing. If we can't enforce laws against female genital mutilation, women will suffer, and also we are allowing Sharia into the United States, which will only lead to more Sharia, which will lead inevitably to the laws about conquering and subjugating unbelievers. So what we need to do is be true to ourselves, enforce our own laws, and we will go a great way to rolling this back. Yes, sir?
I read, I'm not sure it was a year ago, but a story where they had found an earlier copy of the Quran before Muhammad. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah. It was a manuscript of a piece of the Quran, and it was carbon dated to 575 AD. Now, the problem with that is that Muhammad became a prophet. He was visited by the angel Gabriel, he said, and according to the Islamic traditions, he became a prophet in the year 610. And the revelations that Gabriel gave to him, according to Islamic tradition, are collected in the Quran. So the Quran, according to Islamic tradition, was collected between the years 610, was given between the years 610 and 632 when Muhammad died, and then collected together into this form by the Caliph Uthman, the third successor of Muhammad, in the year 653. Now that's the story. This exploded that story because, you see, if there's a piece of the Quran from 575, then Muhammad didn't start getting it in 610. Now, I could have told them that already. 9 years ago, I wrote a book, which is available now, although I don't have any with me of that one. But it's called Did Muhammad Exist? And I look into the earliest Islamic records about Muhammad and other relevant material and show that there is no mention of Muhammad or Islam for the first 60 years after Islam is supposed to have started. There's a stray mention of Muhammad here in one thing from 640, 8 years after he's supposed to have died. But it only just mentions it by name. Doesn't give anything of all the things we know about his biography that come later. And it seems more likely that the Quran was actually put together by a group of people using existing Jewish and Christian material and some Zoroastrian material and making a new religion out of it. Because in those days, this is a very short story out of a very long one, so I apologize if this is kind of confusing. But in those days, there were no constitutions or parliaments or that kind of thing, codes of law even. There was just the king, and the king generally had essentially absolute power. And the empires, when there were empires, were held together by religion, generally. In the days that Muhammad is supposed to have lived, there were two great empires, two great superpowers in the world. The Byzantine Empire, which was Christian, the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Persian Empire, which was Zoroastrian. And those religions were what everybody was a Roman or a Byzantine because they were Christian. That was what was the glue of the empire. So the Arabs conquered all this territory very quickly in the 7th century. And they did not mention that they had a new religion when they did it. Only later do we start hearing about their new religion. And so I posit in that book, Did Muhammad Exist?, that they made up the religion in order to glue their empire together and keep it strong after they had made the conquests. And that Islam actually arises a little bit later than the traditional Islamic sources say, and Muhammad is a mythological figure. And the Quran is made up of all this old stuff that was put together by editors. And that's why you have a piece of the Quran dated from 575 before Muhammad. Yes, ma'am?
So I recently wrote a paper for my religion class for my college, and one of my topics was either to do secularism, Hinduism, or Islam, and to write a paper, the parallels between the two of Christianity and Islam. And my choice was to do the story of creation from both views. They are very similar, but you can tell that the Islamic one is very sketchy. They're like almost not quite the Christian version.
Yes.
And what you just brought up reminded me of my essay. But what I remember my professor saying to me afterwards was saying that while they are similar, they have very distinct aftermaths.
Yes.
While the Christianity, the story of creation after Adam left, we have the opportunity through Jesus Christ to come back to paradise. Whereas in the Quran, it's only if you do everything perfectly will you actually be considered at the end to come back into paradise.
Yes.
So my question is more of like, how do we argue things when it's so close?
Well, I think that contrary to being inclusive, unfortunately, we need to speak about the differences rather than the similarities. Now that goes against all the conventional wisdom, and that's where people are going to say, oh, see, Spencer, you really are a hate monger. Because all the interfaith dialogue initiatives, whether they are carried out by the Catholics or Protestant groups, any Christian Muslim dialogue, they always focus on what the two have in common. And I think, well, that's just great, but then why aren't we all one big happy family? What we need to do is discuss what divides us, and then we might possibly come to some new understanding. But we'll never do that by talking about how, well, both in the Bible and in the Quran, there's Adam and Eve, and God creates them, and they get expelled from the garden and so on. Yeah, okay. Well, then why do you have a separate religion? So there is one very key passage for this particular question, which is chapter 91, verse 7, which says that Allah created the soul and perfectly proportioned it and imbued it with evil and with piety. He imbued it with evil and with piety. Now, once again, I'm not asking you to believe me. Maududi says that this means the Creator has embedded in man's nature tendencies and inclinations towards both good and evil. Now, that's fundamentally different from the Christian understanding. The Christian understanding is that God is good and created human beings good, and it was their rejection of God that brought evil into the world. And so you return to God and you will be good. With the Quran, the good and evil are both there, both from Allah. And I think that that's a very telling difference in the two stories. Because if you think that Allah put both good and evil within you, then you're not really going to have a problem when Allah says, when you meet the unbelievers, strike the necks. Or fight against the people of the book until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. You'll have no trouble thinking that Allah might command you to do things that other people would think are evil. Because that's what he does. Yes, ma'am.
I was just remembering something in my mind to the point of where is America and where are we going? I believe it was 1954 when Abdul Nasser was giving a public speech, and one of the questions was the Muslims were trying to take over Egypt. And he
Hijab?
laughed.
Yeah.
Remember?
Yeah.
And he said, "You think my wife is going to go around with a sheet on?"
Yeah, you try to tell them. You convince them to put it on. Yeah, what we're talking about is Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt in the 50s. And there's a very famous video, which is almost certainly still on YouTube, where he is criticizing the Muslim Brotherhood. Because the Egyptian government has been fighting against the Muslim Brotherhood ever since the Muslim Brotherhood was founded in 1928. Egypt is not a state that imposes Islamic law, although, as I explained before, it has a very strong influence there. But the Islamic State, the Egyptian state wants to prevent the Brotherhood from establishing an Islamic State in Egypt. So the Muslim Brotherhood was saying all the women should cover their heads because it's in Islamic law that women should cover their heads and never venture out in public with head uncovered. In those days, you can find pictures of Egypt, pictures of people walking along the street in Egypt in 1958 or 68, or graduation photos of colleges in Egypt, and the women are all there and they're not wearing their head coverings. And now, take the same university, the same college, the same street, all the women are wearing head coverings. And Nasser actually scoffs at this and says, he's saying, speaking to the Brotherhood guys, saying, you want all the women to cover their heads? You convince them. And everybody laughs. But the laughter ultimately caught in his throat. It actually ended up, this all happened after he died, but the Brotherhood did make tremendous inroads and was able to make most women think in Egypt that they had to cover their heads. And if they don't, they do get attacked on the street. And that's happened to American reporters in Egypt. Female reporters who go there and they're not covered. Now, how did they do that? They appealed to Islam. They said, this is Islam. If you don't cover your head, Allah will hang you by your hair upside down in hell for all eternity. And so on. And so they were able to appeal to people on that basis and transform Egyptian society. Now you might ask, well, how did Egyptian society, they were always Muslim, or at least they have been since the 7th century, how did it
Arabs.
become, they were Arabs before they were Muslims, but, no, actually, I'm sorry, they were not Arabs before they were Muslims. They were there before they were Muslims, but the Arabs came with Islam. The Copts were and are not Arabs, the original inhabitants of Egypt. But more recently, I would love to go into all this history, but you will find it in the history of Jihad. But most recently, what happened was, under Western pressure, Egypt abolished the dhimmi status and the second-class status for non-Muslims in the 1850s. So did the Ottoman Empire, the Turks at that time. And because there was a widespread perception that the Islamic empires had failed. The Ottoman Empire was the last great Islamic empire, and it fell after World War I and was completely abolished by 1923 when the Caliphate was abolished, the Caliphate being the successors of Muhammad. There was a widespread understanding in those days that Islam had failed because this great Islamic empire, the Ottoman Empire, that looked like it was going to conquer Europe, did not conquer Europe and ultimately fell apart. And who was in the ascendancy? The British, Christians. And the French, Christians. And the Americans, Christians. And so Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, actually was, he hated Islam. And he set up Turkey on secular lines, modeling it after Western governments. Egypt, to a lesser degree, also adopted Western secular ways of government. And ever since then, there's been this tension in Egypt and elsewhere between those who think this is all illegitimate and we have to restore Islamic law and those who are opposed to Islamic law. Yes, sir?
Isn't the current president of Egypt attempting to maintain secular?
Yes,
He's working hard, and didn't he give a speech about a year or two ago about reforming?
Yes, he did. He gave a speech to a bunch of imams saying they needed to work for Islamic reform. Nothing happened. Nothing was done. Because you don't mess with the perfect religion, you see.
Mm-hmm.
And Sisi, however, he did overthrow the Brotherhood in Egypt in 2013. And see, this is where it becomes difficult and paradoxical. Because in the United States, we believe in democracy. We have democracy here, at least for now. Maybe not for much longer if things keep going the way they're going. But in Egypt, if you have a popular vote, the Muslim Brotherhood will win. Because most of the people there are Muslims, and most of them think a Muslim majority state should be governed by Islamic law. And so Sisi has a very uphill battle. He has a great difficulty. And unfortunately, he has to practice steam control. You know steam control? You have a steam boiler, but if it gets too hot, you have to let off some steam, which is where that expression comes from, so that it doesn't explode. You have to be old enough. I'm an old guy now.
I remember.
Steam heat. Anyway, the Sisi government practices steam control, which means they let the Brotherhood do what they want to some degree, so that they let off some steam and they don't try to overthrow the government. And one of the things that he lets them do far too often is persecute the Christians in Egypt, who have a terrible time.
It's the bully syndrome, once again, coming through
Yes,
and pushing down.
yes.
Hmm.
The name, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
the name Jay Smith,
Yeah, the guy in England, right?
the guy in England who, he's got many videos and very, very knowledgeable PhD who devotes his life to the subject, has devoted much of his life, apparently, and he's an American, a citizen. He seems to be working with a group in Europe, nationwide, worldwide, that is researching the history and may, in some of his videos, be reflecting that there may be a conclusion at some point with plenty of evidence that the Quran was fabricated as opposed to being a religion.
Well, I went into that earlier.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
that it was put together. I do believe that. It's in my book, Did Muhammad Exist?
Okay.
There's a lot of material about the Quran and how it doesn't look like it was written by one person, which of course in Islamic belief it was all not written by Muhammad, but it was all recited by Muhammad and written down. And that, well, a lot of the contradictions in it come from the fact that it was combined from various different traditions. We could talk about that all night, but anyway, it's in the book. Did Muhammad Exist?
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Do you cover the association of the Muslim Brotherhood in all the other Muslim countries during World War II?
In World War II, yeah. As a matter of fact, what I do is write books, folks, so pardon all the commercials. But, yes.
So with their association with the National Socialists?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Because that's one, from my research, that's, I don't call it a problem, but they still, because they don't forgive, they want revenge for that.
Who wants revenge for what?
Especially Muslim Brotherhood, for us taking out the Nazis.
Oh, yeah, sure. Absolutely. But I have a book coming out on December 3rd that you can pre-order now at Amazon. The Palestinian Delusion, The Catastrophic History of the Middle East Peace Process. And it really is, it's another history book. It shows all the history of the negotiations between Israel and the surrounding Muslim Arabs and why they all failed and what happened and why they were rejected, which ultimately all comes back to because it's a jihad, and drive them out from where they drove you out does not, that's a principle from the Quran, chapter 2, verse 191. If non-Muslims are ruling what is considered to be Muslim land, then the Muslims have to drive them out. And so Israel will never have peace there. And they just have to be strong. But in any case, in the Palestinian Delusion, I go through to a tremendous degree, also in here, actually, in the history of jihad, perhaps even in more detail in here, the story of Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Hajj Amin al-Husseini was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, the Muslim leader of Jerusalem. And he lived in Berlin from 1941 to 1945. And he was friends with Himmler and Eichmann. And he met with Hitler. There's famous photos, and there's even a video of him with Hitler. And he actually wrote to Hitler several times protesting because the Nazis, before they started killing all the Jews, they were exiling them, or they were allowing them to leave. And he was saying, you can't do this. You can't let them come to the Holy Land. You have to do something else. And it seems that he was one of the people who encouraged them to go with the idea of mass killing rather than exile. And after the war, when the Nazis lost, he went back to Egypt and he started working against Israel. And the British and the French, they never prosecuted him, even though he was a Nazi war criminal who raised up an SS division for the Nazis, preached in Arabic to the Muslim world, telling them they should support Hitler, and quoting the Quran to try to get them to do it, quoting the anti-Semitic passages in the Quran. The Quran says the Jews are the worst enemies of the Muslims, chapter 5, verse 82, and there are many other anti-Semitic passages in the Quran. So all al-Husseini had to do was quote the Quran to get the Muslims to think Hitler was great and to favor Hitler. So yeah, there's a great popularity of Hitler in the Islamic world. Just recently there was a story I had at Jihad Watch about a restaurant in Kurdistan. Kurdistan is supposed to be full of moderates, and those are our friends, and it is to a tremendous degree. But in Kurdistan, in Iraqi Kurdistan, this guy had this restaurant, Hitler restaurant, with the swastika on the outside, and all this Hitler stuff, this Hitler theme inside the restaurant. And people loved it, because they love Hitler. In Mein Kampf is a perennial bestseller in Turkey and in Egypt. And what's really, I think, a shame about this is that people don't realize how this happened. They don't realize that there is a convergence between Nazism and Islam because Islam is anti-Semitic. I actually debated a guy years ago at UCLA who wrote a whole book saying that the anti-Semitism was never in Islam and came into Islam with the Nazis, when al-Husseini was with the Nazis in Berlin. And there was never any Islamic anti-Semitism before that. Well, he didn't know his history. This book shows that there's anti-Semitism all through the Islamic history, and that's why the Nazis were attractive to the Muslims, not the other way around. Yes, sir?
What's the difference between the Hadith and the Quran?
The Quran is the perfect word of Allah, delivered through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad over 23 years, without any defect. It's absolutely perfect. It was the mother of the book. The al-Kitab was in paradise with Allah for all eternity, and then delivered piece by piece to Muhammad, and that's the Quran. Now, the Hadith are reports. That's what the word means, report. And they are reports of Muhammad's words and deeds, because the Quran says, chapter 33, verse 21, Muhammad is the excellent example. He is, and that's an absolute phrase, that he is the one you've got to follow. And if he does it, it's right. So Muhammad is the excellent example. How are you going to know what Muhammad did? He's only mentioned 4 times by name in the Quran. So you go to the Hadith, which are reports of his words and deeds. You would need a wheelbarrow to bring in all the Hadith. I have 30 volumes of Hadith in my office, and I don't have all of it. And the Hadith, when they're considered authentic, are normative for Islamic law. And they are said, Muhammad said this, Muhammad said that, and so that becomes Islamic law if Muslims consider it authentic. Quran plus Hadith equals the Sunnah. The Sunnah is the basis for Islamic law from which all this is derived. Yes, sir.
So basically what you're saying is that Hadith, if they consider it authentic, so it's almost at the point where somebody can actually make something out of thin air.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Actually, I was given a little bit of a short answer. I know it seemed like a long answer, but I do try to keep these things short. And I'll never forget one time I was speaking in Florida, I think it was, and I was given one of these answers, and then there was a guy, he was right about over there. And I don't mean to point at any of you, because obviously you weren't him. And he was doing, and so I thought, okay, I will try not to be so long-winded. So anyway, this is the deal. The Hadith, this is one of the main reasons why I don't think Muhammad is a historical figure. Because Muhammad is supposed to have died in 632. But there's nary a peep about what he was like until the early 700s. The first biography of Muhammad wasn't written until about 730, 100 years after his death, or more, 750, 125 years. The Hadith collections come from the 9th century, 200 years after Muhammad. And it's not like this was an oral tradition, because oral tradition, somebody would quote, and they would say, you know, Muhammad said X and Y, and somebody else would write it down in something. There's nothing for the first 60, 70 years of Islam. And then you start to get these stories about Muhammad. Where did they come from? People made them up. They didn't come from the real Muhammad. How do we know? Because they're full of contradictions. And that is the clue as to what happened. What happened was, once Muhammad became established, and that's a whole other story, how he became established as being the prophet, then different groups of Muslims would make up different stories about what he said and did that justified what they wanted. So you see, if this group over here was in favor of one thing, they would make up a story that says, Muhammad says we should do it our way. And then this rival group over here would say, no, 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 Muhammad says we should do it this way. And there are all these fake stories. Even Muslims will tell you that there are all these fake stories of Muhammad. So there's a whole science of Hadith, which is devoted to determining which are the authentic stories and which are not. And there's an elaborate process to do that. And I really will not be long-winded and get into that. But the point is that Bukhari, the imam who put together the most reliable, according to Islamic sources, the most reliable Hadith collection, that is pretty much all of it is normative for Islamic law. Bukhari is a 9th century imam. The story goes that he went around the Islamic world and he collected 300,000 Hadith, and then he figured out which ones were authentic and published them, 7,000 of them. I have Bukhari, it's 9 volumes, it's a big book, and it's 7,000 Hadith. But that means that he decided that 293,000 Hadith were inauthentic, were fake, were made up. And I think he was right about that, and he was also 7,000 off. The others were made up too. Maybe one or two more? Yes, sir.
Yeah, gentleman over here made mention of the effect of revenge in Islam.
Yes.
September 11th,
Yeah.
2001. So what's behind that is September 12th, February.
Yes, September 11, 1683.
By
Yes.
the Polish and Lithuanian cavalry into the camp of Sullivan.
Yes.
And that's how long revenge lasts in the Islamic mind.
Oh yeah, it's indefinite. Chapter 5, verse 45 of the Quran says, we ordained for them a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a nose for a nose, an ear for an ear, a tooth for a tooth, for all wounds like for like. Now, that's a total revenge philosophy. And you can say, well, that's in the Bible too, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But then at the same time, in the New Testament, there is turn the other cheek and pray for those who persecute you and love your enemies. So that's not the whole story. But in the Quran, it is. And on September 11, 1683, the Muslims were farther into Europe than they ever got before. And they were besieging the city of Vienna in Austria. And the siege was broken. And by September 12th, they were falling back. And so a lot of people think that Osama bin Laden, with a very long historical memory, decided on September 11th for the attack, as if to say, now we're back and we're picking up where we left off, and avenging that defeat.
I have this thought, and it's been going around. I'm going, no, don't talk about this, because you know, this is all new to me. But as I told you before, it's been like a mirage, and I'm not sure what's real and what's Memorex. And when I think about Obama, he was like the fracker of America to bring up agitation again against, you know, this whole people against people, you know, racist, bigots, all of that.
Yes.
And so he, to me, as I'm hearing you speak, was starting to be that hand from within to get the people from within to start working against each other. So am I thinking this correctly?
Yeah, and he doesn't have to have been aware of that to be that.
Yeah.
Just like, I keep forgetting, Martha Hennessy, is that her name?
Yeah.
She doesn't know she's a tool, but she's a tool. She doesn't realize that she's being used, but she's being used. And Obama was a tool and was being used on a far greater level. Now, of course, there's always the possibility that he knew very well what he was doing. And I think there is a case to be made for that to some degree.
Yeah.
For example, he was photographed during the 2008 campaign reading a book, The Post-American World, by Fareed Zakaria, the CNN commentator. And Fareed Zakaria is a very far leftist, and in his book, The Post-American World, he does what the title suggests. He says, America is the source of all our problems because America is the world's lone superpower. And all the rest of the world resents America and is jealous of America and wants to bring America down. And that's exactly how we can fix this. That if America is just as squalid, dirty, and dangerous as everywhere else, then nobody will be trying to gun for us. There'll be peace. And so what we need to do is weaken America politically and economically and societally, and that will bring peace to the world. Now, doesn't that sound like what Obama did for 8 years?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And he was reading the book.
Yeah. And so then again, I bring it back to, you know, schools. And I'm really worried about our children, and I don't remember the interview, but I remember going, oh my God, this is a teacher speaking to these kids in the way that she's speaking to them. So now we have an infiltration there. I mean, talking about
the schools are completely taken over because nobody was paying attention. And the Council on Islamic Education, which is another Muslim Brotherhood linked group, and other Islamic groups, they went to the textbook manufacturers, you know, Houghton Mifflin and all those people that make public school textbooks. And they said, we will vet the textbook material for you so that you can make sure that it's not racist and bigoted and that it's fair about Islam. And all the textbook manufacturers said, great, okay. And they let them. And so now, pretty much every textbook in the United States, in terms of social studies and history and whatever else that's related to that, they are warmly positive toward Islam, practically proselytizing for Islam, and harshly critical of Christianity and Judaism. And I see this all the time over the years at Jihad Watch. I've seen so many parents look into their children's books and they're shocked and they go complain to the local school board, and I'm all for that, that's great. But it's a much bigger problem than local schools.
So we as a people, and you know, I can only speak for myself, what do we do on a day-to-day basis to start to educate without, you know, you get all excited, let's say you're an Amway person, you go, oh my God, I've got to recruit you.
Yeah, I think we could use a little Amway for this.
So, but you know what I mean? How do we somehow bring to light, crack the egg open, let some light in somehow without, you can't push a rope.
Try to press the contradictions. Okay. Like somebody was asking me earlier about how is it that these feminist groups are all, they had Linda Sarsour with her hijab at the head of the Women's March, although she was just fired, and they put in another one with the hijab, Zahra Ballou. And they fired her too because they keep getting noticed. But the thing is that feminists are completely in the tank about Islam, and they won't criticize the mistreatment of women in the Islamic world. So I would say if you have feminist friends, you can press the contradiction and ask them, why is it that you don't care about these women who are being killed for not wearing the hijab? Where's your concern for their rights? Are you really serious about being in favor of women's rights? Well, then don't they count? You see, things like that, because there's a whole lot. That's a very rich field once you start doing that.
Well, it's just, again, you're opening my eyes, and again, it's a very complicated, intertwining road that you're attempting to teach us and doing better with others, and, but I want to be awake to this.
Okay. Well, I'm going to take one more. I'm sorry, I do have to get to bed eventually. Yes, sir. It's earlier where I live, nonetheless.
Part of our daily activity is studying stuff like that's in your book, being aware of what's in the Quran, being aware of what Sharia law is, and once prepared, then we're able to refute and talk to people. Having the facts is what's really important, because most of these people with this nonsense, this liberal nonsense, don't have anything to back it up.
Well, yeah,
so
you notice.
can deflate them very, very handily. But what I wanted to ask, under the Obama administration, the Muslim Brotherhood had people in all sorts of the government, and they were changing the language and the words used. We couldn't use Islamic along with
Yeah, he took that all out of counterterror training.
What is it now with President Trump? Has he rooted some of these people out and gotten rid of them?
Not as many as he
Still
should have. And I not fault him for that. He's under tremendous pressure. The president is certainly aware of this problem. His statements make that clear. But he's facing entrenched opposition from the bureaucracy that's in place in the FBI and these agencies that is resisting him and won't do this. And so his counterterror program does speak about Islam and allows agents to study Islamic texts in order to understand the mindset of the enemy, which Obama had forbidden. But that he can put that in there, that doesn't mean they're going to do it. You know something, I'm actually writing for the first time in 10 years, I'm working on a book now that's not about Islam or jihad. And it is a historical survey of all the presidents of the United States and rating them based on how good they were for America and how much they put America first, which ought to be sort of the common sense bar for whether a guy is good or not when he's the president of the United States. Is he good for the United States? And the reason why I mention it is because I'm going through all this history. I'm working up historically, and so I'm way back in the early 19th century so far. I just started it. And I'm reading about the spoils system. You may remember the spoils system from social studies class or whatever. That it used to be that the president, when he became president, would fire everybody in the government, practically, and put in his own people. And this was considered to be, it was called the spoils system because it's the old phrase, to the victor belongs the spoils. If you win, then you get the prize. So this was a big fight all through the 19th century. And finally, in the 1880s, the Civil Service Act was passed that was reforming the spoils system, actually destroying the spoils system, and putting in the idea that these appointments in government jobs would go to people who were qualified, and that would not depend on whether they were with the president's party or not. And everybody in every book that I am reading to research the book I'm writing, everybody says this was great. And it ended a whole lot of corruption, and now we could get the best people into government and they're not thrown out because they're in the wrong party. Okay, great. But my history is a renegade history, as you might have expected, going against the conventional wisdom. And one of the ways that I'm doing that is I'm endorsing the spoils system. I'm saying we should bring it back. That what we see is something the civil service reform people never foresaw. They never saw it coming. but it's here. That we have an entrenched bureaucracy of far-left Democrats who can't be removed, and they hate the president, and they want to impede him at everything he tries to do. And I think we should go back to the old way. Trump should be able to have his people in positions of power. And I'm saying this for everyone, all the way across the board. If we elect Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in 2024, then she should ought to be able to put in her people. And that would be a disaster, but I think the president ought to be able to carry out his program. And the Civil Service Act makes that impossible. And only now are we seeing how dangerous it is. And Andrew Jackson was right. The spoils system is a great idea. Hooray for Martin Van Buren. And on that happy note.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Again, on behalf of the Sullivan County Republican Committee, I want to thank you for being the people who were willing to come out, not be intimidated, not capitulate to the progressive socialist Democrats in this state. You know, it's always interesting when things get rough, when times get hard, I look to my left, I look to my right, I see who's there by my side, and I see who's in this room tonight. I want to thank each and every one of you. And this is the first of many speakers that are going to be coming to Sullivan County Republican. And very simply, God bless each and every one of you. God bless America, and thank you for being here.
Thank you.